Hello, good afternoon, everybody. How is everyone doing? You good? Feel refreshed after lunch? Good. So we'll try not to send you to sleep, but instead revive you in some kind of way. Firstly, thank you to Maria and also to Yannick for the initial invitation that they put out to me to join this conversation. I very much appreciate being here. I don't come from the world of literature or children's books. I'm an art historian by training. I teach visual communication, photography, a little bit of exhibition design at the university and cultural studies. And I spend my days really unpacking images. I also am deeply interested and committed into interrogating the art of slavery and colonialism, not to stay in the past, but in order to ensure that mistakes are not repeated. So I'm here as somebody who has spent a lot of time in the archive. I'm here as someone who teaches about visual culture. I'm also here as somebody who collaborates with and curates artists, particularly post-memorial artists who are also invested in cleansing or healing from history. So I thought what I would do today is really share with you some questions and concerns that have emerged as part of my work. And in particular, I wanted to think together with you in montage. So there's not necessarily a linear narrative, but I'm just going to throw out provocations, since this is not my scene, so I can just throw out anything and see what lands. And in particular, I wanted to think about stories and images which engage what it means for Black women in particular to be represented and also to represent, and then to think about what is at stake. So the title of my talk is inspired by this comic illustration by the Swedish Korean graphic visual activist Lisa Wollrim Sjöblom, and she now lives in New Zealand. Her practice is one that I have been using to think deeply about images. Her practice is very much about using images to counteract the stereotypical images that have been particularly produced in a Scandinavian context. And of course, there are resonances around the world. Her recently published graphic novel, Palimpsest, Documents from a Korean Adoption, is an emotional memoir about reconciling with transnational identity, both in Sweden and in other contexts, and belonging, but also to process the racism suffered in that Swedish context whilst preparing at the same time to have her first child. So here in one of her many pieces of visual activism, which you'll usually see on Instagram or on her website, hashtag representation matters, I was really interested in this gesture of refusal shown here as a bold kind of like rejection, like a downward thrust. And that's something I wanted to theorize with, as it insists on ideas and tropes and images that must finally be thrown into the garbage. And as we know, there's a lot of cleaning to do. I also think it's important to explain or expand the terms used in my title of this talk, and it's interesting how I was listening to you earlier, sort of grappling with this language of inclusion. And thinking about like what does representation and what does matter and mattering actually mean? So this is my hack. Okay, it looks really weird because I'm a Mac girl and we've converted, and so this is what's happened. But hopefully you can still read it. So the word representation has many practices, whether we understand it intellectually through Stuart Hall as the production of meaning through language, and that can be also image language, or we can use it as a way to articulate the responsibility of turning up and being present, being or becoming a metaphor. We could also hyphenate the word, representation, and consider that as sort of acts or gestures of return or corrective practices involved in counteracting historical inheritances. And the historical, in some respects, brings us to this issue of matters and mattering. Because for things to matter, they have importance. So they're issues and concerns of importance that need to be reviewed and discussed. And it's also about the things that have value. When something matters to us, it's kind of treasured, right? So things have value, they have density, they have resonance. This is all been built into the language of mattering. And then if one asks the question, what is the matter? Which is also another way to sort of provoke this language. In this context, I might simply respond, imperial duress, which is a term I borrow from Anne Stoller's book from 2016, Duress, which is really thinking about the force and weight of long, oppressive, and unfinished historical sagas and how they repeat themselves in the present day. So these are the terms by which I kind of come to you today, and hopefully this mini hack makes sense. Okay. So I want to properly begin by presenting two contrasting representational practices or impressions. They contrast quite significantly, but they're also interconnected, I think, and they trace the lines around my particular field of inquiry and interest. So this is an image of my mother, which I often draw strength from. During the 1990s, she started an evening course in dollmaking. And she decided that she would start to make African dolls dressed in the costumes of different tribes from around the continent. This creative practice was one aspect of her many efforts to curate the images that myself and my sisters were surrounded by and exposed to when we were growing up in London. I look back now and understand my mother's doll making as a deeply poetic gesture, a decolonial gesture, seeking to create beautiful and cultural images in an environment that did not quite know what to do with the Black body in representations. These are gestures filled with healing ointment for all those moments when we were there, when we as her daughters would pick up a magazine or would approach the makeup counter and wouldn't see ourselves reflected back. She tended to her dolls in the same way she tends to her plants or crafts wholesome meals. In all this work, she is, as Alice Walker writes, radiant, almost to the point of being invisible, except as creator, hand and eye, she is involved in work her soul must have, ordering the universe in the image of her personal conception of beauty. Her face, as she prepares the art that is her gift, is a legacy of respect she leaves to me and my sisters for all that illuminates and cherishes life. She has handed down respect for the possibilities and the will to grasp them. So that's the first representational practice and the first impression I kind of bring into the room. The second practice I share is actually similarly concerned with visibility. Earlier this year, a young researcher called Deb Raji at Toronto University, who was working in collaboration with MIT Media Lab, published the findings of a study they had been conducting on algorithmic bias in all the major facial recognition softwares. So algorithmic bias is a term used to describe what happens when computers and machines mimic the biases of human beings. They found that Amazon's new software, which is called recognition, but with a K, regularly mistaken the faces of dark-skinned women for men at least 30% of the time. Now, this isn't a new debate in the technology world. We know of early issues with Google representing black people as gorillas and so on. And you'll probably remember the scandal with the iPhone X in 2017 that couldn't register the faces of its Chinese users and actually its producers, which is very ironic. So on their website, and these are taken directly from the website this year, so this is new branding material. Amazon has now produced a range of diverse images, such as the ones you see here, overemphasizing the inclusiveness and accuracy of their software. So the black woman you see here is indeed 100% female, 100% smiling, and 97.4% happy. Also, there's a group of graduate students, all from minority backgrounds or different ethnicities, who can now all be seen by the facial recognition software. But at the same time, this kind of ghost of history is still ever present, because issues of safety and the possibilities to explore and adventure are still connected to normalized white bodies. Even in their attempts to be inclusive, this ghost of history is still present. So those are the two representational practices. For I cannot appear by myself or to myself, unlike the sensory acts of seeing and hearing, writes Nicholas Mirtsov. Appearing is a social event. It is a common encounter between myself and those to whom I appear. But all those present do not necessarily agree as to the meaning of that appearance. So this is part 2 on ghost work. I'm just going to show you a few images without talking side by side. In her book, A Map to the Door of No Return, Canadian poet Dion Brand writes, "One enters a room and history follows. One enters a room and history precedes. History is already seated in the chair in the empty room when one arrives. Where one stands in a society seems always related to this historical experience. Where one can be observed is relative to that history. All human effort seems to emanate from this door. How do I know this? Only by self-observation, only by looking, only by feeling, only by being a part, sitting in the room with history." So what does it mean to sit in the room with history? I am sure many of you in this community will know about actress Lupita Nyongo's children's book, Solway, which I have here, published earlier this year, which is illustrated by the wonderful image maker Vashti Harrison. I think she also illustrated some of these woman rebel books. This book is also a mini memoir in which the main character grapples with her image as a dark-skinned child in a family where everybody has lighter complexion than her. Solway was born, writes Nyongo, the color of midnight. The book attempts to maintain a sensitive and positive tone throughout, even as it grapples with the pain of invisibility and practices of self-negation. Here, for example, Solway is shown eating the lightest and brightest foods in order to shift the tone of her skin. While Solway is not overtly a history book, the story resonates with past and present vulnerabilities, and more specifically, the stigma of blackness as it affects children and adults in all corners of the world, and most sadly, in Africa. Stigma, stigmata. Okay, we're a bit lost. No, we go back. Stigma, stigmata. Stigma, 1, a mark of disgrace associated with a particular circumstance, quality, or person. 2, stigmata, marks corresponding to those left on Christ's body by the crucifixion, said to have been impressed by divine favor on the bodies of St. Francis of Assisi and others. And stigma, 3, in medicine, a visible sign or characteristic of a disease. As a sort of poet at heart, the meanings of words and where they take you in language is very important to me. So I want to spend a moment thinking about the marks and traces left by history as they once again appear in the story of Solway. Traces embedded in our consciousness, in our inherited memories, in our emotions, they're latent under the surface of the skin. So I begin by showing you an advert produced last year for the Nigerian market by Nivea.
I need a product that I can really trust to restore my skin's natural glow.
Nivea Natural Fairness Body Lotion containing unique berry extracts and UV protection to restore your natural glow and care for your skin.
Hello, here to pick up your sister?
Mommy!
Mommy? Wow, such beautiful glowing skin.
Reveal your natural glow with Natural Fairness Body Lotion from Nivea.
Whatever. I need another life with these brands and just be like, talk to me. This is not making sense. So this is a recent advert for Nivea Natural Fairness Body Lotion, which has been promoted in the non-Western market and particularly in Nigeria. If you watch it on YouTube, you will also find a lot of vloggers and bloggers attesting to whether it's any good, confirming that it is not a skin lightener, but it does make your skin soft, but some say, no, it makes it dry. So there's a whole community talking about this product. And some emphasize that it's not a bleaching product and tend to dry the skin. But most people think it's worth buying. So if you had sort of paid attention to the advert, you would have noticed how the woman in the advert is at least 2 shades lighter by the time the advert is over. Her skin offering a more pronounced tone of yellow, and thus compared to that of her lighter-skinned daughter. The hashtag for the campaign is Glow Like a Bride. So what we are witnessing in this advert is in fact a slow erasure, a reduction of the African woman's body and identity to a beauty standard enabled by promises with a bottle of Nivea body lotion. Remember that the advert states that the product will restore the skin's natural glow, not enhance it or maintain it. The slim white plastic bottle containing, again, more hacks. The slim white plastic bottle containing white lotion promises much on a sort of semiotic and rhetorical level. Trust, care, glow, restoration, a return to the natural order of things. And this natural state is fairness, an expression of the concept of whiteness that offers African women beauty and youth and potentially a husband. The Colonial Archive has much to say on this matter, on this normative state of fair beauty, and ultimately on anti-blackness. And I don't want to upset everybody this afternoon, but I will offer a few examples of what I mean. In 1775, Enlightenment philosopher Edmund Burke would write that the colors of beautiful bodies must not be dusky or muddy, but clean and fair. He goes further to tell the story of a boy born blind with cataracts who was cured suddenly, miraculously, and the first person he sees is a black woman. And it's, quote, I think on the right-hand side, he says that the boy was struck with great horror at the sight, and that this was the result of the quote-unquote natural operation of blackness. And then he later goes on to write that, you know, this discomfort was very unsettling for the eyes. A lot of energy was spent getting to the bottom of blackness, at least in a European context and an Enlightenment context, which is really to say that this was the period that mapped of intellectual inquiry that mapped over transatlantic slavery and the kind of beginnings of imperialism. And a lot, philosophical discourses and artistic discourses attempt to explain why Africans had dark skin. Ooh. Wow. Okay. That's fine. There's a lot of cognitive dissonance in this space, I tell you. Okay. Are they literally fixing upstairs? Great. Thank you. Oh. One has to, you have to have a sense of humor. Process what I'm saying. Okay. Right. Well, yeah. I mean, nobody really likes this archive anyway, so it makes total sense. So, for example, here in this French anatomic text, the breast and thumb of an African woman have been dissected to explain the strange juice inherent in pigmentation. So there was all of this discussion during the Enlightenment period about, is it the sun that makes dark skin, or is it some sort of bile underneath the skin? I should say, and it's important to say, even in the face of these archival documents, that this was a whole woman. This was a whole woman, a whole being at some point with a life. Mercury's retrograde, so I expect everything. Okay. Nope. No.
And you pick up from wherever you think.
Sure.
If you feel you need to go a bit backwards, you decide.
Okay, no, we need to move forwards from here. That's clear. Okay. So I think it's all important. I mean, I'm not going to be in this archive for too long, and the message for the universe is clear. However, one thing I should say, and this is just one aspect of my work, is that even though the archive has participated in a certain kind of fragmentation of African and African descendant subjectivity, for me, it's always important to recognize, you know, that however we find these individuals, whether they are represented as types or in paintings or prints or seen through the lens of colonial photography, that we recognize that they had a full life, a full emotional, sentient life with family and kinship groups, even if these are relations and connections that the archive refuses to tell. So that was the point I was just going to make about this, that we are looking at a Black woman here, even though she comes to us now in this archival French context in bits and pieces. Oh dear. Okay, so and there is more. I'm saying oh dear because I don't particularly like Edwin Long, but I will mention it. That really, what we find in this archival context is also a lot of contempt that develops as a direct result of Europeans participating in the enslavement trade. And the use of this academic intellectual discourse to legitimize dehumanizing practices. So in this case, a Jamaican planter who was part of the landed, you know, gentry and aristocracy, but also connected to the British Parliament, he wrote a history of Jamaica in the 1770s and then presented all of these really grotesque views of Africans in which he kind of was particularly cruel about Black women and mentioned that they had the habit of entering into sexual relationships with monkeys. And of course, there is many more images that emerge out of this archive. So the kind of writing that you would find now in a historic library, in books and pamphlets, was not just being produced in official publications, but they also appear in personal diaries and journals. And those are the ones that are the most interesting, but also the most challenging sometimes to read. So here, for example, you have a page from the diary of a man called Jonathan Troop, who was a Scottish doctor who migrated to Dominica in 1788. And his journal, you know, does what most journals in a colonial context did, documenting the experience, talking about the plants and the flora and the fauna, talking about the people and their habits. And also mentioning the ways in which he and other diarists would treat the indigenous or native peoples. So on this page in particular, we have not only writing from Jonathan Troop, but his own attempt to represent a woman who he describes as mulatto through an image. And on this page, it says in fancy English font, mulatto woman in her mourning dress, they are slaves too, most of them taken as housekeepers, make shirts, are very prolific at times when she is chaste. If not, and then this is underlined, many abortions are consequence. So what you're seeing here is an observation of the ways in which women of mixed heritage had very, very small privileges in the context of slavery in the Caribbean. Mixed heritage meaning that an enslaved woman had a child by a European colonizer. So Blackness in a colonial context has always been burdened by over-representation, but also by these ways, these kind of ways of categorization based on color that have found their way into our present day reality. So that lightness is always associated with having a little bit more power and privileges. This is the full circle back to Lupita's book, Solway, and why it resonates so strongly with all of these historical lines of connection. This is just, oh, okay, we go back. This is another mode of representation in a colonial context and comes out of the work that I had been doing in my first book on caricature. And here you see a joke in which there's been a very fancy party at an aristocratic mansion, and everybody got up to all sorts of shenanigans, and now this print is representing the morning after, when everybody has come to their senses. And you find on the second row a man who's probably a servant saying, "Oh Lord, oh Lord, why I have not slept with you," and he calls her a black devil, and she replies, "Is you did, and you be very pretty man." So the joke is like a double joke that's on both of them, on her blackness, but also on his stupidity. So let's look at a blank screen. Because while I love the hashtag representation matters, and I think representation matters, I'm increasingly wondering what the state of affairs is in terms of the world of images. And I have been speculating, especially with my students, about a world without images. If we just said today, no more images, let's stop producing, no more Instagram, no more Snapchat, no more Facebook Live, no more, let's just stop. What would happen if we anticipated a world without images? And I think that this is a kind of healthy speculation, maybe a kind of design fiction that is worth thinking about, since the world is so saturated with all kinds of images, with conflicting and competing meanings. And also the reason why I put a blank screen here is because it actually pains me to reproduce and restate the violences of the archive. Especially here in a room full of people who are very optimistic and positive about ways to do things better. But because these histories are unfinished and the wounds that they created have yet to heal, I feel it's important to sit with the discomfort of looking at these images and just sort of face them for a short while, so we're clear about what needs to be thrown in the garbage. So we're clear about the deep ethical responsibilities that come with making people and their stories visible. And also so that we can be vigilant about the ways people can be so easily reduced to essences. And more so in the realm of children's and youth fiction and literature, where you have such a short amount of time in which to tell a story and set the terms for an imaginary encounter. Stereotyping, writes Erskine Peters, is essentially faulty inference, a movement against perception of the wholeness in an object, and that object can be a book, it can be an artwork, in the case of writing, or it can be, in the context he was writing it, racial ephemera. The stereotype focuses upon superficial characteristics and only those. The creators, in perpetuating only these characteristics, exclude what is valuable, individual, and human. But how does one know when a stereotype is being produced or reproduced? How do we know when power is out of balance? Oh. So I just prepared a few questions that I thought could be useful to kind of throw out there for you also as talking points. That are about representation. The first being on the level of being a practitioner of any kind. What are my blind spots? And we all have them. So these are the things that I do not see because of my culture, because of my history, because of my position. What are my blind spots? I think this is an ethical question to ask. Certainly as a researcher, I have to ask it, but in general, in different forms of cultural practice. Are the ghosts of history present, visually, semiotically, typologically? Are we looking at something that has already been done, right? And in a context where before it wasn't positive or empowering. The third question, who is leading and who is supporting? Or, these are supplementary questions, who stands for the human? What is the balance of power? And I think the conversation this morning really got me thinking about this idea of like producing universal stories, but the readers themselves already having an intuitive sense of who really stands for the human, and that confirming a sort of a normative type, right? So why can't a black woman or a disabled black woman or a child who only has hearing and not vision, full vision, why can't they stand fully for the human? And that we understand humanity through their experience. And this is a question that we can ask ourselves, but also our readers, I think, or students. Another question, how are ideas embedded in images? Sometimes subtly, I gave you a couple of image reading tactics, and sometimes overtly. Do the characters represented meet or defy expectations of their social or cultural group? Who is shaping the imagined world? I think this was the discussion that we were having just before lunch, right? Who is actually making the choice about the way in which a child inhabits the possible and impossible? And lastly, who appears in the future? I'm like deeply invested in this. That's why I'm like a total sci-fi geek. I want to know like who really appears in the future, because that for me determines like what's healthy and what's not. Yeah. So those are just a few questions that I'm kind of throwing out there as provocations that I'm asking myself, but I think could be useful to ask in this particular context, thinking about voice and story and image. Okay, I will conclude on the right to exist. So, Solway Story left me with so many competing affects and impressions. I mean, I got this book quite recently, and on the one hand, I thought, this is so beautiful. On the other hand, it was very, very painful to read. And I actually had quite a lot of dissonance around it. I mean, even though eventually the story arrives at a place of self-love and honoring of difference, arguably the journey that the central character takes to get there is a little quick and doesn't really work that way for most of us, right? It takes time to undo or detox from a lot of harm. It also activated memories of playtime in the kitchen with me and my sister. We would kind of put dish rags over our heads and then like flick our heads left and right to kind of copy what it would be like to have the long hair of our friends at school. I mean, you laugh now, I've got no hair now, but still, you know. I can see myself like in my mind's eye doing this and just thinking, oh girl. And then ethically, I also struggled a bit as I considered what usually happens when Black children's vulnerabilities are exposed in Western cultural contexts. More often than not, there is a failure to honor stories and emotions, and whether that's on the streets or in the classrooms, and sometimes even in the family. So I saw this as a very vulnerable text, and Lupita herself wrote it perhaps in a state of vulnerability. She says it was catharsis for her. So I struggled with that because I wanted to make sure that this story was honored, because so many people have been through this particular sort of line of self-denial. But then I was like, but there's so many children who need this book and need to, not necessarily need the book, but need to recognize that what they are going through is a normal part of reckoning with the imperial duress. Yeah. I also thought about the author not needing to be entirely defined by her complexion, and the ability for her to change her mind later on in life. And this is something we have been discussing in Malmö. We're talking about ethics, that Malmö is opening a new museum on migration and democracy, and oral histories is going to be central to that. And of recent weeks, we've been talking a lot about this idea of, if you collect stories from people who are vulnerable right now, what are the ways in which you can enable them to catalog, but also to somehow understand that just because they said this thing in the moment now, they're not tied to it. They can change their mind. They can take a different position. So this idea of not constantly being fixed to traumatic stories. But because the characters' feelings in this book were well tended to and validated in a very gentle way by her mother, but also by the way the book is beautifully presented, I thought, okay, I think it's a beautiful book. And as Bell Hooks alludes to in the dedication of her own book on representation, Black Looks, such a book project can be necessary as a tool for encouraging all children, but particularly those of African descent, to love themselves. She writes, "It is only in the act and practice of loving Blackness that we are able to reach out and embrace the world without destructive bitterness and ongoing collective rage. Holding each other close across differences, beyond conflict, through change, is an act of resistance." And with that thought, I will say thank you and ask any questions.
Thank you so much. Holding each other close.
Yes.
Passava logo para vós. Quem quer partilhar os seus pensamentos ou colocar perguntas a Temi? Estão a processar ainda. Maybe I can ask the first question. We have to throw a lot to the garbage.
Yes. A lot of
But
things.
how do many people know what garbage is and why it is garbage?
Yeah.
There was a big discussion in Portugal a few months ago because at Carnival, the school in the north of the country asked children actually to disguise into other children. And we had blackface and we had yellowface and we had wigs. And a big part of the teachers of that school and of the parents did not understand what the fuss was about. And they didn't know. It is ignorance. Is it enough just to claim, to scream ignorant? Many people don't know. How can we work around that?
Yeah. Oof. It's such a big question because as a historian, as someone who is okay with the dust of history, well, just about, when you speak to other historians, we tend to recognize like loops playing out in the present. And so if, on a practical level, if, let's say, an organization is developing a project concept, I think it's healthy to have, maybe not all the time, but to have historians or people with a historical consciousness in the room. And this is to shortcut the process of having to, first of all, educate people about what happened, and then get people to sort of process it and embody it, and then make a change. That takes a long time. So maybe to shortcut that process, it's just good to collaborate across disciplines and to bring in people who can just notice things. In the same way, I work with artists because they notice things that I don't. And this is how we share knowledge. This is how we co-theorize about what it means to be human. I don't think we have the solution in any one body. But I think if we don't face history for what it is, what it was, and how it impacts us in the present, we are doing ourselves a huge disservice. And that is not a Pan-Africanist statement. That is like a sort of a disciplinary statement. Yeah. because, and I mean that because we also have in our culture, particularly in West African cultures, we have this philosophy is you need to look back in order to move forward. But it's not a t-shirt slogan. It's very real, because when you're really looking carefully, things that can seem progressive on the surface suddenly are just restating what has already come. So that's one way I could answer your question. Thank you. Wait, okay.
Querem esta?
Hello. Actually, I have a question now that you mentioned the blackface and yellowface, and neither the teachers or the parents or the children being able to understand. And I really, I am under the impression, and I don't know if I'm right or wrong, that here in Portugal, the way the colonialism is taught is very different from where we as colonized, the way we see it. And it's like slavery is not that big of an issue. It's like there is no responsibility on Portugal, on they don't take responsibility. And it seems to me that it's very difficult for them to understand what is wrong with doing blackface and yellowface and and this sort of things, if there is no recognition of it at all. So is it true? Is this the way that Portugal sees the... I don't know. I'm asking because I have no idea. So,
something that I could also say to add to this is that sometimes it can be overwhelming for people to make the link between something that happened in the 17th century, for example, or even 1492, and what is happening in the present day. And I've been thinking a lot about how do you call it, ABC primers? You know the children's books where you learn how the alphabet, yeah. But looking at the ones that were produced in the early part of the 20th century, where you would see some more direct racism in terms of N is for the N word, or you would see racialization happening in these ABC primers. And you notice them a lot. They've got them in Scandinavia. They've also got them in Germany. And I've been thinking maybe instead of trying to take people back to this, the beginnings, start at a place where we think about, okay, what is our semiotic racial inheritance, right? How have we started to think about identity through the learning process?
Exactly.
Yeah,
that's my point.
And then it's like, oh, okay. Well, in the 1920s, we were reading books that told us that how to associate words and images as they are racialized together, bodies with words, right? And then we can use that as a way to think forward. Like, okay, this is how we learned about what is an apple and what is a black person. How can we change that? That's kind of an easier thing, I think, for people to do than to do this jump to, this story that it just seems so abstract for people.
There was this famous in the sense of influential sociologist, Portuguese sociologist, António Barreto. He wrote recently in a big newspaper that we cannot be held responsible for something that happened, I don't know how many years ago, and somebody answered, yes, but why do we feel proud for something that happened also that many years ago? Yeah, so we are a bit contradictory, and we see that a number of people in Portugal, perhaps of a certain age, maybe age doesn't make a difference, but a number of people who are writing for newspapers, opinion articles, they have this kind of position of, are you asking me to apologize, and apologize for what?
But, okay, so Stuart Hall described in a British context the this kind of, I mean, he calls it's kind. I mean, scholars have described it amnesia, but he describes it as decisive mental repression, right? So it's a choice to, and this is part of the stereotyping process, right? So it's a kind of stereotyping of history, that we choose to select the things that make us feel good, and the things that don't, well, it happened so long ago, it doesn't matter. And the thing is, and this is the bit that I'm really trying to grapple with, and because I've done research on racist ephemera and also worked on human freaks and exhibitions, so I have a lot of layers of inquiry that are about what is happening phenomenologically in the body in terms of our curiosity, but also in terms of our emotions around these things. And because so much of the things that we produce in culture are emotionally driven, even though we might not necessarily want to admit it, I think that part of this historical reckoning is also realizing that it's deeply personal for everybody, not just for the people that are offended or the people that were formerly colonized. It's personal for everybody. I mean, people's relationships to the stories that, you know, like we all have, like the Moomins is permanently etched in my mind. That's probably why I'm in Scandinavia now, you know, because at 3 and 4, this is the books I was reading, right? Unconsciously, it was like, go to Finland. But it's, you know, it's like these stories are connected to our experiences of home, of family, of good and bad relations, of love. So we have to, we can't extract those emotions from the things that we read and did in that emotional context. And I think that's the bit that people are finding difficult to do, to admit, I'm taking this personally.
Sorry. I don't think it's a matter of apologizing. It's more of saying, yes, that happened. And there is no, let's say, if you have cancer and you deny you have cancer, you're not going to get better. How are you going to seek treatment for a disease that you don't admit to yourself that you have? So it's the same with inclusion, with racism, with it. If we want to be representative, and if we want to be inclusive, we have to have this recognition that this is an issue, and we have to deal with that. And this is my question: how is it dealt with in schools? Because this is the future. We're trying to do something now, but it's throughout the children that we know how it's going to be alike in the future, if it's going to work or not. So how is it here right now? What's happening right now?
Have we got teachers with us? I think we have. I don't know if they are here right now. Anybody who wants to share? No? I used to think, I insisted a lot that my son would go to a public school. It was very important for me that he went to public school because I thought he would have a different worldview and a view of how diverse the world is. But the truth is, if we speak about black students, he has one colleague who is black. And then I was talking to another colleague who is black also, and she told me, yeah, but people live in neighborhoods and they live separated, so they go to school separately as well. Even if we think that public school is the platform where people get to meet and young people get to meet, the truth is they don't meet because we live in different neighborhoods.
Okay, perhaps I could share with you, please, our experience because we are teachers. Okay, perhaps I could share with all of you our experience because we are teachers in a secondary school in Amadora, and it's a huge school. In fact, it's a cluster of schools. Do you understand? We have a cluster of schools means that, okay, we have a secondary school, a middle school, and 3 primary schools. And for instance, we work in the secondary school. And in that school, Ciumara da Costa Primo, we have 35 different nationalities. Our students come from 35 different countries. And there are lots of African students. And we deal with them. I believe that most of them realize and are aware that there is no prejudice against them. You know, do you know what I mean? Because we go to our classes, and it doesn't matter if they are black or white, if they come from China or Ukraine, if they come from Afghanistan. So it's a different experience, and it's very good for us as teachers, you know. And I'm not saying this just to be just to. I am saying this because it's true, you know.
And then you.
My
Yeah.
question is not about that.
All right.
I'll go up.
Hello, my name is Paola. I'm from Mozambique, but I live in Portugal since I was 3, so for almost all of my life. And I studied history in Portugal. I studied the colonization, the slavery period, and I don't agree with the teacher who spoke before, because I really felt the prejudice. I never saw myself when I was studying, because there was not representation at all. And when you get to know something about yourself, about your roots, it's only regarding slavery or colonization, and always on a bad way, because you don't have nationalists, you don't have people who struggled for our independence. You only had people who submitted to the colonizer, wherever. So I really don't agree that the school integrates and that the students don't feel the prejudice. I don't see it happen in Portugal, unfortunately.
André? Ficou depois com esta.
Just to comment the teacher's speech about the school. In Amadora, where those teachers work, there are a large community of black children. And to support what Maria has just said, those children, I had an experience in a school in Amadora where the majority of the students are black. They make the representation. So, in some cases, the white people want to share with them, with the black people, their roots. And I assisted, I saw many white people, children, learning other languages so that they could all talk between them and teachers couldn't understand it, okay? So I think it's all kind of who are in the majority to be empowered by those pairs. It doesn't mean that there is no other power. There's an institutional power, which is another thing. But between communities, if we share and if we are a large number of different people, it's more probably that we can share, and there could be lots of different empowerments.
I don't know if someone else wants to talk about this topic. Like, I have a
It's
question
your
about
turn
something
now.
else. It's my turn, thank you. I was wondering, and this is actually something that's been pestering me a lot, so I'm sorry to unload this on you. And this may sound like oversharing, but it's not. I've always known since I was very little that I was a lesbian. And there is, like, as a grown-up, I feel good about it, and it's cool, and I like it, and I play around with it. But when I was growing up, there was a lot of rage that I had that never quite fit within the book format. And I wanted to ask you if you feel that rage as a place to exist also, because like for me it was very, very and like extremely annoying to keep seeing stories about people who are sad but not enraged. I wasn't sad, I was, you know, I was enraged. And if you think that there's a place for that too, because personally I believe it's important, but I wanted to know your take on it.
Yes, and I really wish I now was a specialist in children's books so I could whip out some examples. I mean, the only example I can think of is Where the Wild Things Are, and I have no idea how people critically read that book. But I agree on the level of like, the space for rage is also the space for heartbreak, is also the space for healing, is also the space for tenderness and connection. Yes, I agree that there needs to be holding spaces for those kinds of emotions that are dissonant and that they don't fit into our respectability politics that we play between one another. And I wish I knew more about whether books could do that, right? Or because I can only think through the space of art, and then yeah, of course, but but even then, art is increasingly being filtered, right? That the rage is being filtered out because it's very difficult for people to confront those intense emotions. I mean, to be confronted by.
And do you think that there's a place for that? Because sometimes people think that children should not be dealing with those feelings, even though they are. They always are. Like children are filled with rage too. Like
Yes,
it can be
course.
Creative rage, it could be destructive rage, it could be anything.
Yeah.
But generally, even within art as a broader topic, is there space for it? Can it be done?
Excellent question. I mean, I think it's worth thinking through, again, as a design exercise, what can the format, because I mean, you're all focused on literature here, primarily, books. So, I mean, is it possible for children's and youth literature to hold space for rage? I really wish I could answer that question. I don't know. But it's a good question. Yes.
Can move this forward. One last question.
Librarians can tell us.
It's just
We have a teacher as well.
it's just a small comment about even Amadora. I work with theater of the oppressed, but not mainly with racial questions. I have a friend who works with it because I couldn't work in those questions. Just by saying that the main question that I'm referring, is for black people in Amadora is, which place of Africa are you? We don't even think that they are Portuguese. That is just for me, just the question, how it goes, the discrimination in the Amadora. Is it true? Sorry, my friend has a lot of plays about domestic women that mainly are black. Many plays. I could go how many plays they have to discuss this matter. And the people that born in Portugal and the parents were illegal, they don't have the identity. Now they are starting to have, because they start doing legislatory theater. But the main question is, where do you come from, Africa? It's not, are you Portuguese? That's just my comment, I'm sorry.
So,
Well,
Could I? So just to finish.
Yes.
Oh, I have to finish with Dion Brand because I think what she said, managed to do with words, is genius. This discussion perfectly exemplifies what she's saying when she says one enters a room and history follows, one enters a room and history precedes. History is already seated in the chair in the empty room when one arrives. And this is exactly the point that I was trying to make, that, you know, that staying sensitive and alert to the fact that history is still very present with us. And there's a lot to process and to cleanse from, but we can do it together. I think we can do it together. Yeah.
Thank you, Temi. Thank you all. I would really like to think that this is a place to hold each other close and to think of each other's truths. There is more than one truth, and we discover them when we are together and hold each other close. Thank you very much. We'll start in 10 minutes. Is that okay? We start at 4? Yes? Thank you.